All right, guys, here's part 2 of chapter 8, and this is without my face in the bottom. It'd be right-hand corner, so you're welcome for that. Those of you that have complained about not being able to see all of the slides, now you can. So we left off last time talking about Thomas Paine and common sense. Really, I know this isn't very interesting to very many of you, but if you get the chance to read all of Common Sense, I know it's got the ye old English language that's difficult to understand, but really it's an interesting read because it's basically Thomas Paine's argument for rebellion, revolution, and independence. He realizes a couple things. The biggest one is that colonial unity is weak. This rebellion, this war that's going to be fought is going to be very, very dangerous. And basically, he's just trying to get people to recognize that if we're going to survive, we have to separate from England. That's his whole point behind Common Sense. And believe it or not, with the way that it's written, it would have been a very relatable piece of literature for the time period. I know that today when we read it, it sounds very high-minded and very literary. I don't know if I might be inventing a word here, but literarily above where, maybe you and I are. But it was written at the time period for the common man. Basically, if you had the ability to read, you were going to have the ability to understand this. And that was the whole point. So it is one of the most influential. Yes, it was called a pamphlet. It's really in the neighborhood of about 50 pages. I know that today you don't think of that as a pamphlet, but communication has obviously drastically changed in the last, 250 years or so. Basically, he just goes through an entire argument, starting with basically the laws of nature and of the nature of government, and that only lawful governments get their power from the people that are being governed. Governments don't get their power from a deity, from God. They don't get their power from a monarchy. They get their power only from the people that they govern. And if the people that are being governed believe that the government is no longer beneficial or no longer useful or no longer protects them, then they should rebel. There are over 120,000 copies sold in a week. Now, this is important for a couple of different reasons. One, we're seeing that the mass production of literature is possible even at this very, very early point in history. And secondly, this is a very, very, I can tell you that it's the most influential pamphlet ever published, but I can tell you that, the copy of my book that I have sitting in my Google Drive is one of the greatest pieces of literature ever written. But if it stays in my Google Drive and nobody ever reads it, then it's really not. You can't argue with 120,000 copies sold in a week. So this is a very popular, very influential piece of literature. Again, it's trying to convince the colonists that the only cause is independence. We are past the point of reconciliation with Britain. One of my favorite lines sort of goes hand to hand with those last two bullet points is he says something to the effect of, "My goodness, I'm being interrupted by one of you. Just a second." Okay, worthy interruption. We're back. I'm recording this on the day that I think the movie The Patriot is really going to hit a lot of you hard, and that's what one of your fellow classmates and I were just talking about. So, yeah. Anyway, one of my favorite lines from this work is, "There's something so perpetually absurd about an island governing a continent." And that's what that last bullet point means. That's sort of the layman's terms is, it doesn't make any sense that this tiny little island should control an entire continent, like what the colonies rest on. It's a brilliant line of logic, just in terms of the logistics of it all, but also it gives you a great visual image. Sort of like another way to think about it is why should the dog put up with the flea, right? Well, it doesn't. It tries to get rid of the flea. And that's kind of the same thing that we're talking about here is why should America continually be badgered and continually be pestered by this tiny little island, as powerful as it may be? So that's one of the greatest lines, and this works fairly well. Now, Paine sort of sets the groundwork for not only American independence but also American foreign policy. And he also says that, look, the only way we're going to get the help that we need to win this war is if we declare independence, because that's the only way that any foreign nation is going to help us. So this is a very, very key document in several ways. Now, Paine's idea of republicanism. So republicanism is, and it says there, a political society where political power flows from the people. So in sort of large-scale imagery, that's what it means when it says biblical imagery. He does harken back, if memory serves correct, and it has been a while since I've read the whole document. He does have some obviously religious overtones, but the basic point of it is that all officials should get their authority from popular consent. Now, along with that, he's hearkening back to sort of this classical Greek and Roman idea of virtue. Okay, that's what republicanism is based on. It's based on the virtue of the citizenry, and that's not something that's there in your notes necessarily, but that is a concept that you need to have in the back of your head. Is that Paine, Madison, Jefferson, Washington, all of our founding fathers, they built this government with the idea that its citizens are virtuous, meaning their citizens value things like education. They value things like morality. They value participation, honest participation. That's the way the system was set up. Now, we could argue, and maybe we will in class, about whether or not we're still in a situation where republicanism can still work. In other words, is the citizenry still virtuous enough to actually maintain republicanism, and does it still work in today's day and age? Now, historically speaking, this republicanism draws American citizens' attention to British politics, and basically that there's this big conspiracy among the monarchy and the citizens of Britain to basically keep the American colonists sort of under their thumb and under wraps. That's what Paine's work, and that's what republicanism during this time period would have meant. New Englanders especially, if you're talking about the geography of the colonies, New Englanders especially held dear to this because it harkened back to the republicanism that they had practiced really for a long time. We talked about a couple chapters ago how New Englanders were a particularly close-knit group of people, whereas they would settle in these small towns, and the town meeting was a very important part of their daily life. Maybe not their daily life, but certainly their lives. The town meeting and participation in politics would have been a very key component of their culture even before all of this. So Paine's call to this is really strongest in New England, although it does spread into the southern colonies quite a bit as well. But it's certainly most powerfully felt in New England, which also happens to be the center of the revolution right now. And there you see that word virtue pop back up as it pertains to the American citizen. So the two ideas that make up virtue with regards to the citizen in the republic, the citizen has to be able to have an element of self-sacrifice. Basically, are going to be times where I'm going to sacrifice what is perhaps in my best interest for the public good. And then secondly, the collective good of the people is more important than my private rights. Now, we sort of walk a fine line here, because if you know anything about governments at large and how governments are constructed, some of this kind of sounds almost socialist or communist. That might be a little bit of a stretch, but if you think about it in terms of the collective good of the people, is more important than the rights of the private person and citizen. That is kind of a socialist construct in a way. Socialism just meaning that the state is above and beyond everything else. The government is above and beyond everyone else. The important difference here is the people versus the government. In socialism, what we now know as modern socialism, the government is a representative of the people. That doesn't always mean that it has the people's best interest in mind. Here, the people are the people. They are the actual physical people on the street. And the whole idea of self-sacrifice or sacrificing of personal interest for the public good, that is sort of the basic human contract, the basic social contract, whereby in order to protect ourselves, we're going to sacrifice a little bit of our own self-interest. And the example, and it's an extreme example, is in order to protect my property, in order for the law or the state to protect my property from theft, I'm going to refrain from thieving from somebody else, from taking from somebody else. Even though taking might be in my personal self-interest, it might be better for me to go to my neighbor and steal his horse in order to plant my ground. I'm going to refrain from that so that my neighbor doesn't come and steal my seed so that he can plant it on his ground. There's a concept of sacrifice inherent in every law, even in the most democratic, or what we would consider the most democratic of countries. Now, not all patriots are going to agree with Paine. Some favor a rule by sort of a natural aristocracy. We just got done in my general U.S. history class talking about this idea of social Darwinism, whereby the most wealthy, or in this case, the most fit, the most talented, maybe politically, are going to be the rulers. This is not a hereditary aristocracy whereby your titles are passed down to you from your parents, but rather a social hierarchy. In other words, if you can prove yourself through the social ladder, then you deserve to be a part of that natural aristocracy. It's difficult to follow, though, because that would require a transfer of power. Now, American republicanism and sort of the debates over it is going to continue for the next 100 years. So I don't expect to solve these issues in this class this year. I don't even expect to fully explain all the problems with it here in this short little lecture. But it is something that we at least need to discuss in some detail. Now, we come to Jefferson's explanation of independence. Richard Henry Lee, who is from Virginia, moves, and there's the quote, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. That happens June 7th of 1776. That is really your Independence Day, is where we declare our independence. It's an informal declaration, but he moves. At this point, the motion is not adopted until July 2nd. During this time, Jefferson has started to work on his Declaration of Independence, which we'll talk about in class once we get done with the movie. And a motion at that point, July 2nd, 1776, that is where we get a formal motion for a, quote, Declaration of Independence. Now, this is going to be the point where we're going to have to stop, mainly because of time, but also I think this is just a good stopping point for round 2, for chapter 8. Next time we're gonna sort of jump into that explanation of independence that you see there in front of you, so you're kind of getting a little bit of a preview of what I'm going to talk about. We'll also talk about the committee. We'll talk about the drafting of the Declaration, and sort of why Jefferson was fully qualified for it, as it says there on the screen before you. So we'll see you in class today, and see you next time for part 3.